we're at the top of the hour right now, and we have a small yet excellent group. I see Duncan is on.
Hey, Duncan.
Tucker, Morgan, Sharon, myself.
Could I just stop screen sharing, and we don't need to really see the slide, do we?
Nope.
And then we can,
See, it seems like fire circles ought to happen in the evening with a bonfire and a beer.
And a beer.
That's right.
I've got some sanitizer that's been sitting on my desk. I'll just,
Oh, I thought you were gonna light it on fire.
waste that alcohol? Are you kidding me?
Dual purpose.
Hey, Sue. All right, good. Great. A lot of folks. Good.
Eating lunch. When I'm done, I'll turn on my camera.
No problem.
No, I'm gonna have to turn mine off now.
Yeah.
I can't watch myself eat, so I don't want to subject y'all to the same thing.
Hang on.
Hey, Lena.
Hey, what's this line? There.
We missed y'all at we had an in-person social last night in Missoula.
Nice.
It was
It was
kind
very
of,
fun.
I feel like I'll never take that stuff for granted again after this like long time of not really interacting with people in person.
Yeah, there were probably 25 people.
Well, I would have loved to be there. I thought it was too long a flight.
Yeah. All outside.
Yeah,
so-
Alana told me about it to make me jealous.
Nice.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started. I think there are people that will tune in through this. We have a long time, and we don't need to take the long time. But first, thanks for those who presented and participated. Thank you for that. That was awesome. I know we're all a little biased, but I love that session. Like clearly we picked out how we wanted to do it, but it went really, really well. I feel like we did it from the literally from the cell or the subcellular level all the way to imagine it, talking about the cloud. And anyway, I thought it was really well done. Y'all did a great job. It was really thought-provoking. And the thing that we missed was the follow-up. And what would have happened is, everybody, the typical thing is, right, we've got 15 minutes, you got 5 for questions, and everyone goes, well, I'll just take part of that 5. I'll take a little more of that 5. And you want to explain an exciting slide a little bit longer. And so, that's just the way it goes. And it would have happened that as soon as Sharon was over and her 20 minutes was up and she started walking off to the side, I would have looked over and said, need to talk to you. That was so cool. And then we would have had a conversation in the hallway about something about what she did or about what one of you did. And so we wanted to be able to provide a venue for that with this fire circle because we haven't had that at the bar last night, except for apparently the Missoula people. And then secondly, what we found from doing these, and I don't know, I was trying to think, I've been co-organizing sessions on post-fire tree mortality since like 2007, I think. Where we did that one in Destin. I know Sharon was there for that. Matt, you were there for that. And we seem to do them every 2 or 3 years, whether it's an IAWF, ESA, or AFA meeting. And what tends to happen is there's all this excitement around the time that we all present. And there's a little bit of trailing activity, but it really is these really strong peaks. And then there are these 2 or 3 year troughs where we know that people are doing stuff. And I remember that, that Kristen's paper was really interesting, but we don't continue this. And so what Matt and I talked about this morning was trying to have something that we do to keep some of the momentum going, not being overly optimistic that we could, engage until the next one of these that we deem necessary, but something that allowed us to function a little bit more as a network of people all focused on the same umbrella even though we're focusing on different parts or different areas under that umbrella. And so have a conversation about, sort of catching up about topics, and then transition through this time slot that we have to what are some ways that we might do that. And I think there are a few examples. Matt and I came up with 3 really quickly this morning, but I think if we put that out to everybody to kind of ponder how we might all engage better as a community, I think we'll probably come up with something better than what he and I came up with in 180 seconds this morning. So that was my general thought. Sharon or Matt, you want to add anything before we jump in?
I just want to say I appreciate everyone's contributing to the special session. I think it would be great if we could come up with a better way to network and just even just the breadth of the talks that we had today. I mean, it's so broad, how we can start connecting things so people kind of know what each other is doing, and potentially find better connections so that we could do other research or figure out what Matt and Duncan were talking about, that pipeline for going from research to decision support, and that it's a two-way street too, that we can hear from management needs and where our models aren't working, and to kind of also help guide future research. So it would be, I think it would be great if we could figure out how to communicate better and more frequently. It's always a challenge.
How about you, Matt?
Struggling here. So yeah, it occurred to me that we didn't have any practitioners in this session. We had the decision support that's intended to serve them, but no practitioners. So right, sort of finding a way to involve them would be great. So yeah, no other thoughts at this point.
Okay. All right. Well, the way we had divided the session, someone texted me a minute ago and said, it seems like that session was going on all week, which it felt like at times, but it was long, and it was intended to get that breadth, but in the way we had divided it, there was this sort of, if you want to do it this way, you could say the mechanisms and patterns and applications. There are probably other ways to categorize it, but I was struck a few times, if we talk for a minute about that first portion about the mechanisms, that it wasn't as discrete, because folks brought up that the mechanisms in subsequent talks repeatedly. So Tucker had stuff in there about neighborhood competition. Sharon had multiple spots about where beetles, looking at traits, came in. But were there some, sort of, at least for your brain, unresolved parts of that, or neat epiphanies in that mechanisms portion that that particularly struck you or you want to talk about? We can provide some space for that right now.
I've got just sort of a general, I guess maybe this is best framed sort of a question. I'm excited about the neighborhood stuff, and it seems like there's been some interest in the group about how that might be incorporated into FOFAM, or used, and I've been thinking about it a lot, but the thing that I keep coming back to is it's important. I think it's ecologically interesting, but the thing is, crown scorch is just such a strong predictor of mortality. We get very, very marginal improvements to model performance by incorporating something like neighborhood, or I think climate would be the same thing, where it's maybe fundamentally improving the model because we're capturing the mechanism a little better, but percent accurately predicted stays the same, basically. Area under the curve is nearly identical. AIC is a little bit improved, which is now we know that it's doing something, that it's improving the model, but in terms of like making the model actually fundamentally more useful, I'm sort of struggling with how to think about that, given that it really doesn't improve the percent accurately predicted very much.
Sue, do you have?
I have a question about that.
Were you pre-raising your hand? Sorry.
Yeah, I was raising my hand.
Good.
I'm sort of different from all the rest of you guys, just because I'm basically kind of been out of actively doing research for a few years now, being retired ostensibly for about 10 years. But I'm in the process of just getting ready to do a paper analyzing 15 years worth of tree mortality data from some of the work that I did in Russia. And that does look at both beetle attack and stem char. And one of the things that interests me is that when I was first starting that work, we tried to use crown scourge, but in the structure of those stands and with the low angle of light that you get when you're that far north, we found that we could not reliably get estimates of crown scourge that we felt we were comfortable with. And I wonder, you all are using it very successfully, and I'm wondering if anyone else has had that kind of problem, or whether it's just because of the structure of Scotch pine stands versus the kinds of stands that you guys, and of their crowns, compared to the stands that you guys are working with. I'm also really interested in the neighborhood analysis, because we chose our trees using a point-centered quarter kind of approach. So we have clusters of trees and might be able to do some neighborhood stuff, but the models we've done so far are really good, basically just using stem char and maybe throwing in a little of the insect stuff. But since I didn't give a talk, I thought I would kind of run through that real fast.
I think the obvious place where we struggle with crown scourge is with deciduous trees. And because they may lose their leaves before you can estimate it. And, even if they're scorched, what does that mean if they just reproduce leaves from those same nodes the next year? But I feel like we've been pretty good at being able to visually estimate scorch on most of our conifers. So
There was a phrase that we inserted in that crown scorch paper that was a worry that we've had, and I think it may relate to some of this, that and I'm always careful to say, I'll say something about it being a driver, and then I'll back off that a little bit, and I'll say it's the strongest correlate, and then it may just be that it's the easiest thing for us to observe, because bull char is so difficult in so many different ways, that perhaps it's just some crude indicator, which is great if it works in the models. But as far as like, what's the mechanism? There were a couple of observations during the physiological ones where I was like, wait a minute, what? When Giovanna Battaglia said something about seeing no reduction in non-structural carbohydrates, I think at the same time that Sharon like very quickly turned on her camera and was like, wait a minute, did you just say what I think you said? I was struggling to do the same thing. And I wonder about that part of it. What is it that makes crown scorch such a great predictor? Is it just a great predictor and a correlate, or is that injury, that nick in the armor so substantial that it causes this cascade of outcomes? And I think a few of those talks in the morning really, to me, continue to question that. Is it really what's happening with the leaves that's making these outcomes?
Yeah, I had a thought about that, and I've chatted with Joe O'Brien about this in the past. And I've done some work on kind of allometry in deciduous trees, sort of central hardwoods trees, bark thickness, crown dimensions, things like that. But then also bud dimensions and twig, just the portion of the stem, the branch that connects to the bud. And it seems to, and you start dissecting buds and looking where's the meristem, how is it protected, like how do you kill a bud? If you kill the kind of the fleshy leaves or proto, I can't remember the anatomy that cover the meristems. Do you kill the bud or do you just have to kill the meristems? It's a lot of uncertainty. And then if you start adding things with when there's foliage present and the shielding and things like that, it's just like, what the heck? And so it seems to me that often it's been so long, like back of the envelope calculations would suggest that killing the twigs in a plume is one, simpler to model, and two, I think they're more vulnerable a lot of the times. The bark thickness across this whole range of species scaled with diameter of the branch. So the longleaf pine, really thick branches, thick bark. Something like hickory, thin or beech, thick, thin twigs, very thin bark, and very vulnerable. So I wanted to ask if everyone around the country could just go out and measure the twig thickness and the bark thickness on twigs for all the common species in your area. I think that, so you're saying, okay, so is crown scorch a correlate or is it a cause? Well, if you're killing branches, you're killing there's no opportunity to refoliate that branch. And so I wonder sometimes whether you see scorch, but it's really the killing the branches that matters. Just a comment. But I was hoping Alina to get Alina interested in this and adding something about twig thickness to the and twig bark thickness to the fire and tree mortality database.
I kind of feel like there's a lot of traits that could be added to that database that would be really useful. Like I'm working with people with terrestrial laser scanners, and I'm like, oh, we could get bark rugosity and see if it matters. And I guess the one thing I took from the physiology talk was also really related to bark, in that there's drought effects that may change the thermal conductivity or decrease the thermal conductivity. And having been working on drought and tree mortality, I hadn't thought about that as a mechanism. So I think, I wonder if that would apply at the twig scale as well. So I think those basic physiology, or those basic, I guess, allometric measurements, and getting more people to go back to actually making them is something we really need. And then seeing how much they vary in response to environmental variation.
Right. Sort of, yeah, sort of the way, I look at across all the models that are relating, like crown scorch to mortality and things, and every species has a little different relationship. Well, it's trying to, how can you collapse all those different curves on top of each other? And by incorporating enough process and the key variables to do that. Whether you're killing branches or not might be one step in that direction.
I was disappointed that Andreas wasn't able to make it, because I think he was going to present his work over about those differences in bud size and a heat tolerance over a wide range of species. For European species. So I think it would be cool to have something to do that over a much broader range of species.
I feel like we need to do that systematically based on a very large funding stream from like National Science Foundation or something major to like really develop that data in North America. Of course, I'm thinking big here. Tucker, I wanted to just answer your question of crown volume scorch mattering so much and what's left. We were kind of struggling with that with the drought signal, because it's like so little importance compared to crown volume scorch. And that is why we went and said, well, how much would this matter in terms of the mortality threshold? Like what crown volume scorch leads to mortality. Like that's why we went that route. It wasn't to like sensationalize it. It was for us too. It's like, does this actually make a difference at all? And so that's one way to go about that with density too. It's like, well, if they did a treatment that decreased the density this much, how big of a prescription window do you then have in terms of flame lengths or scorch compared to what you had before?
That's a good point. That's
one way
a nice way to sort of tease out those marginal effects by you're not looking at like the big metrics of model performance, but it based on the analysis that I've done, it does make a bit of a difference in terms of sort of crown scorch threshold, the crown scorch threshold that would lead to a greater than 50% chance of mortality or something like that. I mean, it moves it a little bit, which is interesting, potentially useful.
But it is a good point about especially when you're designing decision support systems, like, how simple do you go for some applications, and maybe crown scorch is just fine for a lot of, coarse estimates of, of general expected levels of mortality, for many management applications. But then sometimes you might need more complex models because of what questions you're answering. So, I think it's a good point to not lose sight of that the immediate management needs, and making sure you're not just creating the models might be statistically more accurate, but not enough to justify extra work, for some applications.
So has anyone looked at whether the drought relationship is tied in with live fuel moisture in the crown? Because if a drier tree has lower live fuel moisture, then you would expect the crown scorch to be higher, right?
Just due to the fire carrying more easily through the crown?
Well, just due to the fact that it takes longer to dry out the needles if they're moister, right? It takes more energy. So that if you have a tree that's drought stressed, you would expect that it would be more susceptible to fire at the crown level in terms of radiant energy coming up into the crown.
Is that what you're doing, Sharon?
I guess that's a good. I mean, we hadn't thought about approaching it that way. We have collected that data. We've done these small individual tree burns in the burn chamber in Missoula, and half of them were drought stressed and half of them weren't, and with two different levels of fire intensity. But I guess we were more thinking that just the I wasn't thinking about it as terms. I guess Russ Parsons is thinking about more of how the drought stress would change the actual flammability of the needles. I was thinking of it more from the physiological plant water status, that it might be easier for different embolisms, or you have a drawdown of NSCs, and so it'd be good we could put that both together. But I don't think a lot of people have looked at that as much. And Chad, do you have a sense? Is that incorporated in some of the physics-based models about fuel moisture?
Yeah.
And how it would affect flammability?
Yeah, I mean, fuel moisture is put in at a voxel resolution, so we can account for it. In all fairness, we put in a static fuel moisture. There's no biology, right? So if I say there's a gram, 100% moisture, that's it. If the plant adds another 10%, I can't account for that. So there is always that limitation. But yeah, we could easily, go from say 100 to 90% fuel moisture in the model, see what effect it has on scorch as a sensitivity analysis. We could even, if we had good data, this is always a little tricky. So say with something like fire tech, you're a 2-meter voxel, 2 by 2 by 2. So how do we average within a crown? Do we assume it's constant? Do we try to account for spatial variations within a crown? No one's done those studies, so it would be interesting to test. And then real quick, I had a question. Has anyone, I think I know the answer to this, but do we know how accurate managers even expect these things to be, or would like them to be, or what can a manager live with, I guess is my question, does anyone ask the manager that out of curiosity?
I've never asked, but seems like what I hear is when things that they try to simulate in FOFM, for instance, doesn't look anything like what they saw after the fire. And we heard this a lot with longleaf pine, but I think that they don't seem to be, because it's for planning, a lot of them look more at the relative change than the absolute change and stuff. And so I don't think they necessarily, at least on the Forest Service side, from what I've seen, I don't know that they want to be all that specific about stuff. I don't know about the Park Service side. They seem to be a little more rigorous on what they do.
And as far as the salvage side, they'd want them, you want it to be as accurate as possible, but usually once you salvage, you won't know which trees you might have cut that would have ended up surviving. You can get a snag field, of all the trees that ended up, if you're wrong on the other end and expected the trees to survive and they all end up dying. But I don't know that I've ever heard a specific range of a target range that they want.
I feel like Chad, your question, you just had two different, the two different pathways, the salvage side and the prescribed fire side, even though planning could be both, which is how the models, how we've always thought about them. But there's also, for two reasons. One, I think the growth part is really interesting for two reasons. One is that the binary mortality is so frustrating. And for those of us who worked on it for a long time, it's analytically exhausting to have you either die or you live. We know there are these shades of gray out there or shades of green. And then the other side of that, Sharon's image, I think your cartoon, Sharon, was really good because it, as simple as it was, it really summed up those different pathways. There is the fire occurs, the immediate decline in death. There's the sort of long-term mortality, and then there is this reduced growth that is tracking what an unburned tree would be, or is suffering through future droughts, maybe a little bit more. And I feel like some of that, if we're looking at using fire frequently in landscapes, those things start to compound. Having a 10% reduction caused by in the original incident, and then having that followed with repeated prescribed fires, I think it starts to become a bigger issue. And I think that's where if prescribed fire is ramping up, or if we're allowing wildfires, or we're managing wildfires that are covering more extent, I think that stuff starts to become really big, and it's probably bigger than FOFM. But I think that's an exciting area, the sort of post-fire growth, and not just not just ending it at mortality. And that could be a really neat, particularly from the modeling standpoint, Chad, you know, that the model can allow fuels to regrow. You can reburn it again and starting to look at what those, you know, sort of nicks in the armor, what they end up being over time, the death by 1,000 cuts sort of stuff, or reductions in growth by 1,000 cuts.
Certainly worry more about model error in like FVS or other simulations that are going over a long time period than in the immediate predictions in FOFEM. So I think just remembering that these things are getting sucked into other modeling systems, some of which we may not even like be that familiar with because they're more like ecosystem models, is really important. Talked about compounding error already, so that's one other place where those small things that may not matter for deciding when, under what conditions you light your prescribed fire may matter if you're going to simulate the landscape out and make climate adaptation planning decisions based on that.
Yeah, I was just going to like throw this in response to what Morgan was saying about, you know, mini cuts and just the, you know, wildfires are, I mean, often sort of present very different conditions. So this summer on the river complex, we were seeing, you know, large old, like I'd say legacy trees, because they're recording information from sort of pre-settlement and from when there was more, you know, historic cultural fire going on. And it was so, you know, so dry. I was in a drought that, you know, cat faces were burning out, root systems were burning out, big old trees were were more vulnerable, it seemed, than, you know, a lot of the sort of mid-sized trees, just from structural. And this was, you know, kind of unique. It was in the Klamath, so structurally, a lot of trees were just coming down. And but, you know, that might present itself differently in other areas that aren't as steep or rocky, maybe in just injuries that you wouldn't get in a prescribed fire, you know, because duff and dead wood and so forth are so dry.
It's similar to what you were finding, Kristen, right? With the cat faces and giant sequoia. And I mean, you probably, I don't know everyone here, but I mean, I know you work a lot with managers or what. So, I mean, do you have a sense of like what would be the acceptable kind of accuracy of, or what managers are wanting from these models?
Oh, good. That's a big question. But yeah, I think, I mean, one thing just really quick, Matt and I had a little email exchange, and I definitely think these things are more susceptible during drought, but cat faces, I mean, they exist because they're susceptible to burning, right? So this has always been a thing. And when you work with managers, and like, especially in giant sequoia groves, we do everything possible to keep fire out of those because it's such a pain in the ass once it gets established in there, right? So, yeah, I mean, it's tricky because I've mostly been on the prescribed fire side. And so with those improvements in accuracy, like I'm kind of going back to thinking about what Tucker was saying, like what, you know, how maybe I'm misunderstanding your question, but like how much difference that would make in a way that would be like change operationally what we would be doing on the ground.
And Chad.
Yeah, I mean, because I mean, your models that you said, like, you know, if you keep it, regardless of a cat face or not, if you keep crown scorch below 85%, which you think you would hope you would do in a old giant sequoia, that, you know, you're not going to be lighting a prescribed fire that would ever create anything close to that kind of that level of crown scorch.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I guess though, I would put a plug in for like beyond FOFEM, how important these things are for managers to know. You know, like you and I tried to put together, we didn't get funded, dang it, but I don't know if you remember, we tried to, when I was at Yosemite as a fire ecologist, we tried to put together a study to look at like seasonality of burning again, and in the context of drought, you know, because I was, everyone's looking to me to be like, should we still be burning right now? And I was like, I think so. Like I think there's a lot of uncertainty in that world. So I think things that particularly, like, I'm really interested in, like, the foliar moisture being more of an indicator of, like, the good times to burn, because I think the other thing, just throwing this out there as a general management plug, is that I feel like I've been seeing on 2 different burns in 2019, I think, where the surface fire behavior looked like, I was like, this is great. We're going to get great effects. This is so good. And then we had a lot of dead overstory trees, like a surprising number. And I think that has something to do with that tail end of drought. Is that a tail end of drought stress? Are they still physically, is foliar moisture lower? Like, not really being sure what's going on there. So I think that these questions may not improve the FOFEM models very much, but they're really important, I think, for starting to think about how we adjust prescriptions and practices in the field.
In some ways, Kristen's talk, we know, was the most depressing of the entire week. So thank you for that, Kristen. And you should have put a.
Well, did you not catch the end where I said there is hope here? We have opportunity on all of these acres. I know.
I had to go to my
I've been
counselor.
walking around giant dead trees for a while, so maybe I'm desensitized, Morgan.
Well, besides it being the most depressing, it also brings up, Chad, the sort of how the value of the resource, that's how that answer, it depends on that value. So like for longleaf pine that Duncan was mentioning, if it's a cavity tree for this endangered species that uses a very a sweet spot of sizes and ages, then it's really, really important. It's a complete failed burn if those trees die. And maybe the same thing is for these monarchs of giant sequoia. And so those are probably good areas for us to learn more about and improve the models.
And with that proposal that didn't get funded that Kristen was talking about, it was also, not just drought, but also, so a drought during if it's in the growing season or dormant season as well, the phenological stage of those, of the tree, and especially the buds, if it could make things even more vulnerable to fire. And I feel like that's some low-hanging fruit that we could probably begin to get at, besides just the trait, like we talked about at the beginning of the discussion, having these trait descriptions, but how that might vary throughout the season is important.
So
go
ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I am really just interested and think a lot about, like, that shifting interactions. Like you said, Sharon, like, people have looked at seasonality and described it in many ways, but under the warming climate, like, I think some of those relationships are going to shift, and that will be really important to understand.
Well, one of the discussion points we had this morning when Matt and I were talking about what this might look like, and this is a lot better than what we thought, so that's good, was Matt said something like, I'm not volunteering, nor do I think we need another review of post-fire tree mortality. But the thing that he did mention that maybe we could transition to a little bit is that link between the research and decision support tools and applications. And I think we had a few really good talks on that. And so maybe if we transition to talk a little bit about that, and maybe we can kind of see where it goes. One of the things we want to get out of this, and it'll probably be a follow-up email, but for those who were interested in submitting to the special collection of fire ecology, we want to encourage that. But does this group set up something like that as a single paper, or maybe, and Matt's suggestion, and I tend to agree that seems like a space that has a lot of potential, because there's interest in ramping up decision support that is necessary for the interest that's ramping up in the use of both managed wildfire and prescribed fire. Is that an area that we might contribute to, or is it too early? But I think generally just to talk about that and get folks' thoughts, because there are a few pretty provocative ones, and I'll shut up for a minute and let and let those folks ask questions and talk about that.
Is anyone thinking about individually submitting a paper to the special collection? I know, Kristen, are you still, you had to express some interest, or want to start us off?
Oh, I was thinking, I don't know if this would really fit. What I had emailed you about was kind of like a much, not sort of like it was just much broader. I was like basically
Right.
trying to put together right now a paper on trends in fire and giant sequoia. That would be like a very squished, not really a research paper, but more like field notes, where we keep giving all these stats to like the media and like 80% of the range is burned. And it would just be nice to have all that, I think, consolidated in one place, as well as the mortality estimates that I was saying, where we used our mortality rates and applied them to other acreages. And so I don't know if that, so I'd love to submit that to Fire Ecology and talk to you about that, but I just don't know if that fits in the kind of what you guys are thinking. Seems like this, like that session or that collection is a little bit more, sciencey.
Yeah, I know it's not. I mean, I think we would encourage kind of also not, I mean, kind of your classic research papers, but also more descriptors. So, yeah, so I think like what Morgan, if I was asking, like, are there, are people planning on submitting, individual papers on generally their subject? And I think the topic you described will be really interesting and fit perfectly within the special collection. But then on top of that are people like, wow, I have this great idea and I would love to lead an effort about kind of bringing together these different pieces or some things that were brought up during the whole 15 talk special session. Kind of both angles. So.
Got it.
Okay. Chad, I know that both Sharon and I asked questions, and you did point out that we are co-investigators on this project. And maybe I was just overly excited because I thought something like that was going to happen, and seeing it was just so dang exciting. But it was so dang exciting. You're constrained in the session to give a talk that's this long. Can you go a little bit more? Because there's always, and Matt and I talked about this morning. There's always the track of the empirical models continuing, and we need to do this, and in the background we're always like, yeah, the physical models will, we need to invest in them because we know that we have limitations with the empirical models. But it seemed like in that 15 or 18 minutes, there were some pretty major advances. So I don't know if you want to go on a little bit, because that, to me, that's just very different than the kind of stuff we've had in the past. And I know I speak for Matt and Sharon that we really appreciated you doing this. You mind going on a little bit more, or maybe share some of your thoughts on where that's going in that sort of potential application space?
Sure. Well, first of all, I'll admit Adam Ashley and I have been talking about submitting a paper. We didn't think about fire ecology because it's a pretty dorky, input output flow kind of thing. But maybe I'll touch base with you guys about maybe updating to fit fire ecology special issue a bit. So as far as the physics-based model, the updates we've been doing, we've actually been able to do this for 20 years. We just never had a good reason to. And sort of a couple projects that Morgan and Sharon are involved on, and one with Adam Ashley that's actually connected a little bit more to hydrology. So Adam's really focused on linking the physics-based models with some hydrological models, including field moisture models. So we've kind of been working, our two projects have been working together to kind of advance this sort of ability to get some moisture involved, as well as the scorch and consumption all coming out. I'm not sure. As far as application space, it's pretty open. Our plan right now is just to do some more validation, a little bit of sensitivity, get the code out there for others to use, although I don't know who else is going to use it besides Los Alamos, but that's okay. So we're really open to, I guess my big take home is we're really open if people have questions or think there's applications like this fuel moisture question. I know Morgan and Sharon and I will probably have some stuff going on, looking at more pattern compared to some field experimentations of scorch. But I think there's a lot of funding and potential right now to work on some questions. If people want to reach out, we're happy to do that. I don't know, Morgan, what you were hoping I was going to say, but
No, that was great.
Yeah, so Chad, I would, in that sense, Reggie talked about bringing other fire models into the big system. And was he talking about maybe Janice Cohen's coffee model, so a couple fire atmosphere, but at a less spatial resolution than what Fire Tech and WFDS are working at? Do you know anything about that?
I don't know if Duncan knows what he was talking about specifically, but I mean, WFDS is available on AWS now. It's open source, free code. So people, if you have a bunch of money to blow on AWS, could start running. And just thought there's two, I primarily talked about Fire Tech, and there's been a lot of discussion about WFDS this week, but there's a suite, there's Quickfire tool, which is newer, which runs pretty fast. And then there's a host of, I don't know the right word, a host of various options within WFDS and FDS to model things. So some of them run fast, some of them run slow. So there's some other tools available that we can try to tap into to make it a little bit more user-friendly. But at the end of the day, they're CFD models. They're not user-friendly for most forest and fire background people. There's just not a good workaround for that right now.
Chad, I was going to say a lot of the managers I'm kind of working with now in California are really interested in spatially explicit tree maps and how doing like ICO thinning patterns then results in forest resilience. So I know a lot of our fire spread modeling is for incident management and risk and, dealing with the fire when it's on the ground. But for those folks, having data that can go from here's my stand, what is it going to look like if it's burned, and how does that then relate to tree mortality on a stand scale to evaluate different like thinning prescriptions that are really spatially explicit, like they are going to be very interested in having all those pieces connect at some point. So just a plug for it's hard for managers to use, but it also depends on their application. If their application is local and they're thinking about those spatial patterns and how those relate to tree mortality and burning, that's of interest.
Yeah, and I think we've been doing a lot of that ourselves. And I'll just give a plug if anyone gets this brought up. Kevin Hires and others have been pushing to try to develop some more regional modeling centers, so where we can hire people who know how to run Quickfire and Fire Tech and connect them with the right scientists and managers to do that kind of stuff. So I'll give a little plug for that as a cool idea in the short term, to try to get these tools where they can be used and useful to get them out there.
Well, Duncan, along these lines, do you, because maybe you didn't, but because I think you did, you had to suffer through all the preceding talks until yours, and I know that you have this overlap in Missoula, but do you see some clear spots where the current body of research and all the different directions that we talked about, how that stuff fits with the future of FOFM or decision support, sort of that your shop is engaged in?
I won't say I have any clear picture. I have some kind of ideas, just what Chad is talking about. We have the Fire Modeling Institute where, so if there are people that don't necessarily know how to use the models, they could go to one of these regional centers and say, hey, can people in FMI help run these applications so that we can get some answers and that kind of thing. The other thing that I'm not sure this really answers your question, Morgan, is that I wonder how useful, some of the fire learning networks are in terms of going to them and saying, hey, we could have a presentation. I could do a presentation on FOFM and say, this is what FOFM does. These are the shortcomings that we've heard about. What other shortcomings are there? Are there things that we can set up to help you use the model to initiate some research or some program to help improve the model, that kind of stuff. And so I don't know if the Fire Learning Network, and I'll admit to not being completely familiar with all the work that they do, but they do seem to be, especially some of them, I'm thinking the one in the Southeast, tends to be pretty related or interacts pretty well with the managers. And so that would be the manager side. And, I think this is sort of a stream of consciousness, sorry. I think that some of the issue, is that managers sometimes think it's hard to talk to people who might be on research. Sometimes, if you're like me, you just don't want to go to somebody and say, hey, your model didn't work for me. And so having some sort of an intermediary of the Fire Learning Network to sort of gather up stuff and say, you know what, FOFM doesn't work with longleaf pine, and so, which is why we changed the program, or, deciduous species in the Southeast, which is why we changed the program. If we sort of made sure that people knew that door was open at the learning networks, then managers could sort of let them know what the issue is. And there would have to be some interaction with us to go in and sort of do a little presentation on what we do and hear back from them. But I guess for me, that seems like a place where we could go to try and find some input on, as we look at this management or research to management needs kind of thing. But I do think that really some of the other conversation here is important, which is that when you have things of high value, like the redwoods, that's more important than burning lodgepole pine, right? And so you might have some different needs for a better, quote unquote, better simulation or better planning in some of these high value systems than in other systems. And that is where people with knowledge, like what Chad said, we have these regional sort of groups set up that could help with some of the more complex models. So that is a very long and somewhat difficult path to follow, but that was my train of thought.
That's perfect. That was awesome.
I think that's a really good idea of just engaging and kind of offering, like just how you said it, Duncan, that you have a short presentation about here's this application, in this case, FOFM or whatever modeling application it is. And then, try to encourage people to give their brutally honest feedback and have that, and the fire science or fire learning networks could be a great way for that.
I also think sometimes asking not just how they're using the tools that we have, but like what data they wish they had that might be related. Because the one thing we were getting out of Washington from this whole post-fire management work we did up there is like, they really want high resolution tree mortality predictions, like higher resolution than ravage. They want it fast so they can update their plans really quickly after a fire. And we're finding that resolution of data wasn't enough. And I don't know if that comes from some type of modeling system or a different observational system, but it's like they want that particular type of data. And so knowing about those kind of open-ended things related to tree mortality that may not be based on a tool is really important as well.
That's interesting. There are a few folks who are on who were not presenters, and Sue already spoke up and admitted it, even though our work is based on Sue's early work 10 years ago. What were your thoughts? If you attended, were you struck by anything? And what are your general thoughts on this topic? I'll call on you. Don't make me do it. All right.
Okay, I'll speak up. I'll speak up for a second instead of sitting here in silence. I just want to say I really enjoyed these sessions because, as I said, I'm getting ready to work on writing this paper, and I'm so rusty on all the methods after not having looked at it for basically, well, I did look at it some in 2018 when I did a presentation in Portugal, but there's so much more people are doing with analytical methods that it strikes me that I have to train myself a little bit more and do a little bit of learning in some of these approaches. So I may be reaching out to some of you guys for a little bit of assistance to get us started. I think my Russian colleagues will do most of the data analysis, but they're not familiar with the methods either. So I've been making a list of papers out of this conference, and I think it's given me a lot better start. It's been great listening to it kind of on the learning end for me. A lot of great work.
Anyone else who wasn't presenting? And then Matt Riley, because of your situation, you can talk now too if you want to.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, and I just want to apologize, especially to the organizers. I don't know. I think my computer was updating and my VPN was operating on its own. But anyways, the session was really valuable for me. I find myself spread really thin these days about the different things that I'm working on. In the delayed mortality stuff, I haven't really been into dig into except for that remote sensing, and it's interesting to hear you all talk, and it sounds like there's all these problems and things like that, but I feel like you're doing a phenomenal job with sort of coming up with new knowledge, and the database that has been put together. And I specifically, I have a very poor background in tree physiology. And so learning about sort of that individual mortality and those physiological mechanisms was really, really helpful for me. So thanks for that. And it's exciting to see what else is to come down the line.
Yeah. So that, yeah, it's interesting to me that, a couple talks on delayed mortality and which seems to have a lot to do with effects near the ground, like on stems, and maybe it's the long-term effects of heating at the stem may be more pronounced in thin bark species, which is interesting and has a relationship with beetles potentially. So yeah, it seems like that's a topic that bears more work and more thought. The data were very revealing.
Totally agree. That was fascinating. Anybody else have anything, any other observations before we shift gears? I'm trying to keep an eye on the time.
I was going to ask just a quick question from some of the things that I picked up, and it seems like, so obviously this injury is playing a huge role, and you have crown scorch, which seems to be the dominant thing that's popping up, but there's also this issue of duff consumption and fine root consumption, and that's not quite as easily measurable. In my mind it's injury, but still potentially a different mechanism. And so I didn't know if there was any work to be able to try and separate the effects out of those, or look at them sort of independently, potentially, in terms of what those ultimate effects are.
Along those lines, I had a question. So I heard somewhere, maybe it was from you, Sharon, some discussion 10, 15 years ago or something. Is there a climatic kind of threshold where, if it's a dry enough system, trees will not have their roots up in the duff because it's too dry too often, versus, further out east, we've heard about the, sort of southern Appalachians, oaks have their roots up in the duff, or the long unburned longleaf pine stands where the trees have their roots, and then you burn it off, and it's very stressful to the point of killing the trees. But whereas that might not happen beyond some certain climatic threshold that maybe you only get out west. I don't know. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh no, I was telling Tucker goodbye. He had it in the chat. Sorry, waving my hand to answer. You can finish, Matt. Sorry.
So was that you that I talked about that with?
I know we've had that discussion for sure, and I've had it with Morgan and Daniel Price, several people, that it does seem to be more of an issue in more humid climates where the duff doesn't get quite as dry as at least the duff right at the base of trees, not in the kind of ambient interspaces between tree crowns, but in that humid environment can allow the fine roots to grow up into the duff. And so when that's burned off, it seems to lead to mortality. I mean, Morgan has that a paper about that and showing kind of a depletion of NSCs, right, in the roots as far as a mechanism. But yeah, Matt, I don't know about any ongoing work. It's kind of been work off and on, but I agree with you that it's certainly a mechanism or should be or at least a pathway leading to tree mortality, but it's hard to, I don't think it gets quite as much interest because it's more a localized effect. I mean, it's certainly a challenge when you're reintroducing fire into kind of long unburned systems, because it can catch managers by surprise. They expect these big old trees with thick bark to be resistant to fire, and maybe especially if there's been any thinning that's changed forest structure, and you're like, oh, I'm good to go, let's burn it, and they not really thinking about those ground fuels and the potential for long-term smoldering.
Yeah, thanks. One thing that we've sort of seen with the remote sensing aspect, and I don't know how many trees y'all have from some of these moister, like we have on the west side, but in terms of the magnitude, we see sort of a greater magnitude and extent in these standard placing regimes, these wet forests, Western hemlock, Douglas fir, whereas the drier forests we've looked at, it's far more subtle. And so I am thinking that crown scorch is probably what's happening in those colder and wetter places, and maybe that more subtle change that we're seeing is some of those bigger trees blinking out. So anyways, I'm going to run, but I appreciate everyone's time on this, and yeah, I'll have my act together next time. So take care. Thank you.
Don't apologize, Matt. I mean, that just happens. It's one of the drawbacks of the virtual conference. So unfortunately, you were the one it happened to. But
Yeah.
but yeah, it happens. And I appreciate you recording your talk so we can watch it later.
Yeah, thanks. I'm maybe glad I was muted during part of that frustrating time. So. Anyways, thanks for everything, y'all. Take care.
Bye.
I know we're kind of wrapping up here, but I guess the thing I've come away from this really thinking about is, especially since I just did this landscape analysis where fire adaptive traits ended up being really important. And then knowing that the bark thickness equations are kind of off, and thinking about terrestrial scanning of bark rugosity, and then these other physiology talks, which really got at that. And when we wrote our sort of tree mortality synthesis paper, we are still really thinking about the modeling, but there's kind of this whole world of like basic plant traits that we have really incomplete information on. And I'm thinking just even like some type of summary of like, if we knew or had data on this across species, maybe we wouldn't have to keep modeling at a species level, or we'd know how to group the species for modeling, but we don't even have that data. So maybe just like some type of quite quick summary of like, here's what we need, could be useful. So.
Well, if I'm ever able to fill the postdoc position that I've been trying to fill for
No.
a year, that's what they will be doing.
Good.
So if you know of any good ones.
I presented yesterday right after I jumped out to go present on Eastern Oak, Southeastern Oak traits. And I'd done some stuff with sort of the Southeastern coastal plain oaks before, and it's the hotspot of oak diversity. And when we started to look at the number of traits, there's a phenomenon, and there's got to be a term for it. And Elena, we've talked about this before. You've got this many traits and this many species, but where the two overlap is like this little corner right here. And so it was 40 species of oaks, and we have full data, and full data is air quotes for sure, on 8. And so 8 were able to do that sort of question. And for this talk I gave yesterday, I was like, okay, I'm just going to take the broader Southeast, from the Appalachians to the tip of Florida, west to Texas, and I'm gonna pull them all together and see what I can get. And just for really simple traits, I could get 12 species, like really, really simple, that don't really tell you that much. And I know that when we have the richness, the depth of the trait data, and you have a sufficient number of species, I have a really good idea of what we'll find. But it is just a totally, second, whatever what you're saying, Elena, like that call for this is what we need, should be emphatic, because it creates this situation where we have to do something 87 times because we haven't just done this original trait thing and say, oh, look, like Matt was saying earlier with twig diameter or bud diameter, like that's phenomenal. If we paired that with some of these other things and say, while I'm here taking this bud, I'm also going to measure vertical bark thickness, and there's a little protocol that we have, and let's see if we can get 87 species that fill this space across North America, angiosperms and gymnosperms go. That's really needed and could be really exciting.
And I mean, I just think of how many species we have in the database that like we aren't really doing anything with because we just don't have enough samples, right? So I know you guys are already working on it and I'm overcommitted, but I think that should be on the agenda for next.
I totally agree. It's a good idea.
So how much information is out there about rooting patterns of these different species? I mean, you sort of touched on that with the idea that maybe when it's moister, you get more rooting up in the duff layers, but I think there's interspecific differences. And I definitely saw this in my work in Russia in mixed pine larch forests, that the larch was very susceptible to surface fires that were of low enough intensity that they were basically not impacting the pines at all. And because it was like a more mesic site, but it seems like that must be a factor in a lot of situations as a kind of data that most people don't collect. I certainly don't have any data. I just have observations. You go out there after the fire and you see that it's burned out all around the larches and they're all dead, but it seems like that might be a useful kind of thing to add in if you're looking at what kinds of factors you should be considering in predicting mortality.
Yeah, there's probably quite a few, like especially old literature that might be more descriptive that we could mine for some of these different traits as at least to get a head start. I mean, I know for some of it, especially the more commercial species, there's different rooting habits described based on sites and how that might change even within a species. But yeah, I think rooting habit would be an important trait to describe in this database that Alina's envisioning.
There's like 800 entries in the TRI database for fine rooting depth. I was looking while you were talking.
Really?
So I don't know if how many of those overlap North American species or if they're from other parts of the world, but someone's been collecting that information.
So do you have a lot of data on northern, boreal systems in that database, or?
It's a global database.
Okay.
So there might be information. I feel like the people from Australia may have been the ones that started it, but there's data out there. It's kind of hard to I tried matching it up with our species in the database, and it didn't end up being like that much overlap, but it's worth looking into.
Because permafrost depth can also be a factor in rooting depth, which could interact with mortality. And I haven't looked at the literature to see how much there is on that in terms of tree mortality and in some of the northern systems like Alaska and far north in Russia. But
this is good. This
So
is
Alina, what was that data set? Just real quick, the international one.
It's the TRY plant trait database.
Okay, thanks.
Individual people, anybody can submit to
Anyone can
data.
submit. They have a nice formalized mechanism for getting data out, but it's all plants, not just trees. So, which is, I guess, good, but sometimes you think there's a lot of records and there aren't actually ones for the species we're looking at. So
yeah, Matt, to second what Alina just said, it is really, really frustrating. TRI is really, really frustrating because it should have these data that you want. And for the southeastern oaks, or excuse me, southeastern tree species in general, it'll shock you to look at Southern Appalachian stuff where people have been doing work on these damn things for a century, and there's a data for this here and over here and nothing in between. It is good luck.
And it's great. I mean, then people need it's reliant on people submitting their data,
Yeah.
right, in being built over time. But yeah, there's a lot of holes in it.
So we're getting a little close, and I know that people are exhausted, and you have to get ready for the closing plenary, which is going to be so good. The other part of all this, and this trait discussion was really interesting because it's something we didn't put on our list, and it's clearly it's an emergent interest. And so to keep some of this going, I know we had a few people drop off, but what Matt, Sharon, and I can do after this is try to keep some of this going in some way. And we had a few ideas. What a few years ago we had, with several of you and several of the people that are that were in the special session, we had submitted a proposal to the USGS Powell Center. That was the idea being bringing people together to work on this for over a period. When Sharon, Alina, Phil, and I were coalescing the fire and tree mortality database, it played a role like that, whether it was intended or not. It caused this dialogue where people were sharing data and there was some interaction. And there are other ways we could do something like that. Matt and I were talking about an NSF research coordination network, the RCN program. There could be a potential for something like that for those interested in post-fire tree mortality. There are other options like that, and this group hasn't been coalesced in a way that transcends the sort of federal or U.S. federal agency, university, NGO, international. There's a lot of room for that. And I thought it was worth us just sort of talking about what might be some ways we could do that. And then beyond the three mentions I had for FTM, the Powell Center, and RCN, are there some other ways y'all see that we could keep a group like this working together to avoid this? That was really fun at the conference. I'll see you at the next conference, and avoiding that blank space or blank time between these in some sort of network capacity.
Kind of feel like we could have a Teams page. I don't know.
Yeah. I went to a conference like 20 years ago at the National Center for Ecological Synthesis. I don't know if that still even exists. It was in Santa Barbara, and it was, they had probably this idea would fit into their mission.
That's great. And yeah, it still exists.
And hasn't it shifted to more of a management focus? Don't you have a big collaboration with TNC?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, but that works. And I mean, we could, there are, I think, a lot of networking platforms like you said, Teams or Slack or different things, but I don't know how well it would require, we'd have to build it big enough to, and make it interesting to kind of keep people engaged, and which is a possibility. It's just kind of, everybody gets busy with their other individual projects. I mean, I know I do. It's hard to, yeah, I don't know how well that would work.
Mike Gallagher and others from the Northern Station, that Fire Science Consortium, whatever that's called, or Fire Science Exchange, North Atlantic, Rutgers, and a few others, they do like a, I don't know if it's a once a month lecture series that is virtual that they did. I think they started it during COVID, and it's been really successful. With a bit, they have a theme that's sort of like a semester like theme. That sounds like sort of a free way to do something. That could be interesting.
I think even something like that is an atmosphere where things don't have to be polished, allowing it to be within, a group of people who may want to know about incremental changes in FOFEM or things like that, or research that's ongoing, like a place where someone can have, like, I know Matt Riley probably wanted some feedback on what they've worked on. He's been working on with that remote sensing platform. So of interest.
Yeah, you could have some sort of standing monthly call, but it still takes a few people to organize that, and have, maybe a 10-minute kind of intro or whatever that someone wants to present, and then with a discussion.
Yeah, there's all the regional science exchanges. Is there a national science exchange that kind of spans regions?
That's supposed to be our Forest Service R&D.
That's, yeah, we need to span better. Yeah, maybe we could propose that to JFSP, create a national exchange.
I mean, I do think the exchanges work together, right? I mean, probably some of them are more than others because of just different kind of shared ecosystems, but yeah, I mean, I think the exchanges are a good place.
You bring up a good point, Matt. I mean, Sharon and I have had this conversation 74 times. The Joint Fire Science Program has funded a lot of the stuff that you saw in this presentation, certainly with the domestic stuff, and we have pushed for the last several years to have them help stimulate this group to maintain this capacity and to keep this engagement going. But that's also a potential idea. And then have them say yes, and the FSINs will help or something like that. But here's funding and an entity that has no barriers to entry, et cetera. JFSP could be a perfect sort of supporter, facilitator of that.
So has JFSP been having annual meetings like we used to way back in the days? That's what I thought. Yeah, because those were
so
really
cool.
those were really great opportunities
Yep.
for information exchange and for bringing in managers as well as scientists. But I think as funding faded, that those meetings faded, and that's, yeah. And also USGS used to have meetings every couple of years of all kind of their people working with fire, with people coming in also from Forest Service and universities. So yeah, something like that would be nice. That's broader, but it would be interesting if JFSP would fund something like what you guys are talking about in terms of something just focused on tree mortality. I don't know what kind of RFPs they're putting out these days, but
Yeah, that's cool.
I think also like maybe the way to do it is ask one of the regional, like there are people who do great job doing the regional coordination for the regional networks. Like having this be something, since they're already hired and they already know how to do it, using one of those people to coordinate something national would be really good.
At the Tucson at FE Congress, we proposed the idea of having working groups within AFI of big themes, and it hasn't really gained traction that I don't think within AFI, but kind of like IUFRO has working groups and SAF, that AFI could provide that platform, and it could be a good, it could be a good way to, I don't know, we'd have to talk with Annie about how that looks on our website, but as far as a way of having a working group and also building that in the future to where other people, working on similar theme, on other themes, like, oh, I want a working group too. So I think that could be a good way to engage our membership and just each other, and put material on the web, maybe host different webinars or discussion groups.
NASA has something similar where for each of their missions, you can opt into a working group and there's an associated Slack channel. So it's not for everyone, you got to opt in, but then you can hear the internal conversations about like data development and quality and stuff. So that might serve as a model.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's interesting. I tried to get on one of those one time, but I didn't get funded.
I just got funded by NASA. It's kind of exciting, but it's
great.
Related to birds, and I'm just doing the remote sensing. So someone else is doing the coolest part of the science. But yeah, I don't know. I feel like there's definitely some other models that we could draw on that would let us like continue to have conversations and move stuff along. So Morgan, you're in charge now.
I think the key for setting up any kind of working group is to have it set up so that it remains active in between conferences, which is kind of what you guys are talking about. Because ones I've been involved in often just kind of, oh, well, when it's time for an IUFRO conference, then the working group gets together and puts together part of the program, but there's not a lot that goes on in between conferences. And that's been true with other organizations I've been involved in. So I think what it takes is for a motivated group of people to commit to whatever it is every month, doing a webinar and then having discussion among yourselves about methods or whatever, and having it be under AFI would be great. but somebody has to be committed to take the leadership and be sure that it stays motivated, or it just kind of becomes yeah, we'll put together a session for the next conference.
Maybe, maybe that's where, what worked well for the fire and tree mortality database, something that's focused around a task, like let's get better trait data, and everyone's got, everyone might have a couple technicians that could help out and sort of just trickle in data and work together, or a software, like a collaborative software, coding effort or something facilitated by like a funded coder, and we all sort of contribute. Yeah, because like so many times I write something in MathCAD, I've been dealing with that lately, or MATLAB, or before that Fortran. Other people work in Python or C, whatever. And often a big problem is translating that code into something that everyone can, that everyone wants to use because it's in some language that they actually use. So maybe that's another focus of dedicated sort of continued work.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's some good. I think our homework for Matt, Sharon, and me is to compile some of this stuff and then kind of do some more feelers. Some folks couldn't make it today. Some folks can only be here for a few minutes. But I think it's incumbent upon us to kind of keep it going for a little bit. And I like that coalescing around a theme, because that, instead of like, I have my Thursday call on tree death, having something where we're working on it means you don't just tune into the Thursday call on tree death. It means I want to report something out and show, and I made some additions to the database, everybody. That keeps people engaged. So I like that. And the trait part would make me over the moon.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else? I have to jump off because I have to go change into my fancy suit.
So fast for the closing ceremony.
Just grab your blazer off the wall.
It's crumpled up in that chair over there.
You should leave on your vest under your blazer.
Oh,
a nice look.
I'll be sweating even more than usual. That'd be great. I'll just do this. I'll have my job. Let's see.
I think I like coalescing around a single thing, but maybe there's initially coalescing and then thinking about putting in a research coordination grant or something like that. If it's going to get to the point where like we're going to collect data and report it, for some people like me, time allocation has to be based on funding, right? And for some people, they've got techs where they can have them go do that work. But I think being able to pull on a coordination grant so people can allocate time to it is good in the long run. Or something similar.
I agree. Okay. All right, I'm going to hop off. Feel free to stay on and chat. I'll see y'all in a few minutes.
See y'all.
Okay. Thanks, Morgan.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Does anyone have any other kind of parting thoughts? I guess, we have 10 minutes left, but it also might be nice to grab lunch or wherever you are. A break.
A break. Yeah. It might be time for a break. Let's get lunch.
Anyone have anything to say? A lot of folks are gone already. They've spoken with their click of the mouse.
It was great to see you all. That's what I'll say.
Yeah, thanks, Sue, for joining us. And
Good to see you, Sue.
So.
See you guys later. Okay.
Bye.
Right.
Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.